At its height, the Roman Empire ruled lands stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the borders of Persia. Its legions crushed kings, destroyed cities, and reshaped the ancient world. Yet one vast region remained stubbornly beyond Rome's grasp, the Arabian Peninsula. Surrounded by Roman-controlled provinces, rich in trade, and strategically important, Arabia seemed like a natural target. So why did Rome, the greatest empire of the ancient world, never fully control it? The answer lies not in a single defeat, but in a complex mix of geography, warfare, economy, and culture that turned Arabia into an unconquerable land. The geography of the Arabian Peninsula was the first and most powerful barrier standing between Rome and total control. Unlike the regions Rome had conquered before, Arabia was dominated by vast deserts, jagged mountains, and extreme climates that tested human limits. To Roman strategists looking at maps, the peninsula may have appeared as empty space, but in reality it was an environment that punished every mistake. The land itself fought against invaders long before any human resistance appeared. Roman armies were designed to move through fertile provinces where food, water, and shelter could be secured along the way. In Arabia, these essentials were scarce. Endless stretches of sand separated small settlements, and water sources were few, hidden, and unreliable. The intense heat drained soldiers of strength and morale, while cold desert nights brought their own dangers. Simply marching across Arabia could weaken a legion to the point where battle became impossible. Supply lines were the lifeline of Roman power, and in Arabia those lifelines were dangerously fragile. Wagons carrying grain, weapons, and water had to travel enormous distances across hostile terrain. These routes were slow and predictable, making them easy targets for disruption. If a supply caravan was lost, entire units could be forced to retreat or face starvation. No matter how powerful Rome was, it could not sustain armies where nature itself refused cooperation. The deserts also removed Rome's greatest advantage: control of terrain. Roman legions excelled on open fields where formations, discipline, and engineering skills could dominate. Arabia offered few such battlefields. Instead, the land broke armies into isolated units, scattered across dunes and rocky passes. Fortifications were difficult to build, roads were hard to maintain, and every advance required enormous effort for minimal gain. Mountains and rugged regions added another layer of difficulty. Narrow passes and rocky highlands slowed movement and made ambushes easier. Roman soldiers, burdened with heavy armor and equipment, struggled to navigate such landscapes. In contrast, local populations moved quickly and lightly, using the terrain as both shield and weapon. The land favored those who understood it, not those who tried to impose control upon it. Psychologically, the geography of Arabia wore down Roman confidence. Campaigns usually brought visible progress: cities captured, lands claimed, borders extended. In Arabia, progress was invisible. Armies marched for weeks only to find emptiness, exhaustion, and retreat. Soldiers began to realize that even if they advanced, holding ground was nearly impossible. The sense of fighting an enemy that was also the environment itself was deeply demoralizing. In the end, the Arabian Peninsula was not simply unconquered because Rome lacked strength, but because the land neutralized that strength. Geography stripped Rome of its logistical superiority, its battlefield dominance, and its sense of control. Deserts, mountains, and climate combined to create a natural defense stronger than walls or armies. For Rome, mastering Arabia meant fighting nature on an impossible scale, and that was a war even the greatest empire could not win. Roman military power was built on a very specific style of warfare that had brought success for centuries. The legions were trained to fight in tight formations, to advance steadily, and to overwhelm enemies through discipline and coordination. This system worked best when Rome faced organized armies willing to meet them on open battlefields. In Arabia, however, Rome encountered a completely different way of fighting, one that directly undermined the foundations of Roman military doctrine. Arabian tribes did not seek large, decisive battles. Instead, they relied on speed, flexibility, and surprise. Warriors traveled light, often on camels or fast horses, allowing them to cover great distances quickly. When Roman forces approached, these fighters could simply avoid confrontation, disappearing into the desert. For the Romans, whose success depended on forcing enemies into battle, this refusal to engage was deeply frustrating and strategically damaging. When conflict did occur, it happened on Arabian terms. Rather than set-piece battles, Roman soldiers faced sudden raids and ambushes. Small groups of fighters would strike supply convoys, attack isolated patrols, or harass camps at night before retreating beyond reach. These hit-and-run tactics caused steady losses without giving Rome the opportunity to respond decisively. Each encounter drained Roman strength while preserving Arabian mobility. The desert environment amplified these tactics. Open sands, rocky outcrops, and vast empty spaces allowed attackers to appear and vanish with ease. Roman legions, burdened by heavy armor and strict formations, struggled to react quickly. Pursuing fast-moving enemies across unfamiliar terrain often led Roman units deeper into danger, exhausting men and animals with little hope of success. This style of warfare also disrupted Roman command structures. Roman officers were trained to control battles through clear orders and formations. In Arabia, battles were chaotic and unpredictable. Enemies did not follow expected patterns, and communication across wide desert spaces was difficult. Units could become separated, commanders isolated, and plans rendered useless within moments of engagement. Over time, the psychological impact of this warfare became severe. Roman soldiers were accustomed to visible victories and clear outcomes. In Arabia, they faced an enemy that could not be pinned down or defeated in traditional ways. Constant vigilance, fear of ambush, and the absence of decisive success eroded morale. Soldiers began to feel that no amount of bravery or discipline could guarantee victory. Ultimately, Arabian warfare did not seek to destroy Roman armies outright. Its goal was endurance. By avoiding decisive defeat while steadily wearing down Roman forces, Arabian tribes turned Rome's greatest strength into a weakness. The Roman army was powerful, but it was inflexible. In Arabia, adaptability mattered more than organization, and this mismatch ensured that Rome could fight endlessly without ever achieving lasting control. Geography was one of the greatest enemies Rome ever faced in Arabia. Unlike the fertile lands of Gaul, Egypt, or the Levant, much of the Arabian Peninsula offered little that suited Roman expansion. Vast deserts stretched endlessly, broken only by isolated oases and harsh mountain ranges. For an empire that relied on roads, cities, and stable supply lines, this environment was not just difficult, it was fundamentally hostile to Roman control. Roman armies were massive logistical machines. Every legion required steady access to food, water, equipment, and reinforcements. In most conquered regions, Rome solved this by building roads, using rivers, and taxing fertile lands to support its troops. Arabia provided none of these advantages. Water sources were rare and often known only to local tribes. Marching an army through such terrain meant carrying enormous supplies, which slowed movement and made Roman forces vulnerable. The desert itself acted as a natural defense. Extreme heat exhausted soldiers who were trained for temperate climates. Heavy armor became a burden rather than protection, draining energy and increasing the risk of heat-related illness. Animals used for transport struggled to survive long journeys without reliable water. Even before facing an enemy, Roman armies could lose strength simply by moving through the land. Supply lines became Rome's greatest weakness. Long routes across empty terrain were easy targets for raids. A single destroyed convoy could leave thousands of soldiers without food or water. Protecting these supply lines required additional troops, stretching Roman manpower thin. The deeper Rome pushed into Arabia, the longer and more fragile these lifelines became, turning every advance into a gamble. Unlike other regions, Arabia lacked large wealthy cities that Rome could capture and use as administrative centers. Without urban hubs, Rome had no easy way to project authority or collect taxes. Control of scattered settlements meant constant military presence, which was expensive and unsustainable. The cost of occupation far outweighed any immediate benefit the region could provide. Mountains in the western and southern parts of Arabia added another layer of difficulty. Narrow passes and rugged terrain favored defenders who knew the land. Roman formations were ineffective in such environments, and ambushes were frequent. Each attempt to secure these regions required disproportionate effort for minimal strategic gain, reinforcing the idea that conquest was not worth the cost. In the end, geography did not merely slow Roman expansion, it reshaped Roman priorities. The empire thrived on lands that could be integrated, taxed, and defended with relative ease. Arabia resisted this model at every level. Its deserts broke Roman logistics, its terrain favored local defenders, and its lack of resources offered little reward. For Rome, conquering Arabia was not impossible in theory, but in practice, the land itself made permanent control an unwinnable struggle. Economic reality played a decisive role in Rome's failure to control the Arabian Peninsula. Roman expansion was never driven by conquest alone. It was driven by profit. Provinces were expected to pay for their own occupation through taxes, trade, agriculture, or resources. If a region could not sustain Roman administration and military presence, it quickly lost its appeal. Arabia, from Rome's perspective, offered far more cost than reward. Unlike Egypt with its grain or Hispania with its mines, Arabia lacked large-scale agricultural output that Rome could exploit. Most of the peninsula was unsuitable for farming, and what little agriculture existed was localized around oases or seasonal rainfall. These small pockets could support local populations but not the massive demands of Roman legions and bureaucracy. Without surplus production, Rome had no reliable way to extract wealth from the land. Trade was often cited as Arabia's main attraction, especially the lucrative incense and spice routes. However, Rome already benefited from these routes without direct control of the peninsula. Arabian merchants acted as intermediaries, transporting goods to Roman-controlled ports in the Levant and Egypt. Rome could tax this trade at its borders, gaining profits without the burden of occupation. Full conquest offered little additional economic advantage. Maintaining a Roman province was extraordinarily expensive. Garrisons had to be paid, roads built, forts maintained, and administrators supported. In regions with cities and dense populations, taxes covered these costs. In Arabia, scattered tribes and settlements meant Rome would have to fund nearly everything itself. The empire would spend vast sums just to hold territory that gave little in return. This imbalance became even clearer when Rome compared Arabia to other frontier regions. Along the Rhine and Danube, Roman armies defended fertile lands and wealthy provinces from external threats. In Arabia, there was no equivalent danger pressing Rome to expand. The peninsula was not a gateway to richer lands, nor was it home to a powerful rival empire that needed to be neutralized. Strategically, it offered no urgent necessity. Roman leaders were pragmatic. Emperors had limited resources and many fronts to manage. Investing heavily in Arabia meant diverting troops and money from more profitable or dangerous regions. When weighed against ongoing wars in Europe, Persia, and internal instability, Arabia simply did not justify the expense. Even successful campaigns would likely result in long-term financial loss. In the end, Rome's decision was guided by calculation, not weakness. The empire understood that power was not measured by how much land it could take, but by how well it could sustain what it held. Arabia did not fit Rome's economic model of empire. It could be influenced through trade and diplomacy far more cheaply than it could be ruled by force. For Rome, conquest without profit was not victory, and Arabia offered exactly that. Politics and diplomacy shaped Rome's relationship with Arabia as much as warfare and economics. Rather than attempting outright conquest, Rome often chose influence, alliances, and indirect control. This approach reflected a deep understanding of Arabia's complexity and the limitations of imperial power in such a region. In many ways, Rome decided it was wiser to manage Arabia than to rule it. Arabia was not a single unified state, but a mosaic of tribes, kingdoms, and shifting alliances. Power structures were fluid, and loyalty could change rapidly. For Rome, this made traditional conquest difficult. Defeating one group did not mean controlling the region, as other tribes could simply move or resist independently. Occupation would require constant intervention in local rivalries, pulling Rome into endless conflicts with no clear end. Instead, Rome relied heavily on client states. Kingdoms like Nabataea served as buffers between Roman territory and the deeper Arabian interior. These allies controlled trade routes, maintained local order, and provided intelligence without the need for direct Roman administration. In exchange, they received protection, prestige, and economic benefits. This system allowed Rome to project power without overextending itself. Diplomacy also helped secure Rome's commercial interests. Treaties and agreements ensured the flow of valuable goods like incense and spices into Roman markets. As long as trade continued smoothly, there was little incentive to disrupt the balance through military conquest. Stability, even under non-Roman rulers, was more valuable than control achieved through force. Rome also understood the risk of turning neutral or friendly tribes into permanent enemies. A failed or partial conquest could unite otherwise divided groups against Rome. By maintaining diplomatic relationships, Rome avoided provoking large-scale resistance that would demand long-term military commitment. In a region where loyalty was personal and honor-driven, diplomacy often achieved what legions could not. Internal Roman politics further discouraged expansion. Emperors had to justify wars to the Senate, the army, and the public. A costly campaign in Arabia, with no clear victory or wealth to display, offered little political reward. Successful emperors preferred wars that ended with triumphs, spoils, and new provinces that enhanced their legitimacy. Arabia promised none of these outcomes. Ultimately, Rome's choice not to conquer Arabia was a strategic decision, not a failure of ambition. By using alliances, client states, and trade relationships, Rome secured its interests at a fraction of the cost of occupation. The empire recognized that control does not always require rule. In Arabia, influence proved more effective than conquest, and restraint became one of Rome's most practical policies. Military overreach and logistical limits were critical factors that prevented Rome from conquering Arabia. The Roman Empire, despite its legendary legions, had finite resources and countless borders to defend. Each new campaign required soldiers, supplies, and attention, and Arabia demanded more than it could realistically provide. Even a victorious campaign risked leaving other frontiers vulnerable. Roman armies were designed for sustained campaigns in regions with established infrastructure, roads, cities, and nearby resources. Arabia offered none of these advantages. Marching legions across deserts, rocky plateaus, and mountainous terrain stretched supply lines to dangerous lengths. Every additional mile increased the risk of starvation, disease, and desertion. Rome's logistical system simply could not keep pace with the demands of controlling such an inhospitable land. The distances involved compounded the challenge. Troops stationed in the Levant or Egypt faced weeks of travel just to reach Central Arabian territories. Reinforcements, communication, and resupply all took much longer than in Europe or North Africa. A minor setback could spiral into disaster because help would arrive too late to be effective. The farther Rome extended itself, the weaker its hold became elsewhere. Arabian tribes also exploited this overreach. Using knowledge of the terrain, they launched raids on isolated Roman units and supply convoys. The Romans, encumbered by heavy armor and tight formations, were slow to respond. Even successful counterattacks provided only temporary relief. The tribes could disperse and re-emerge elsewhere. This constant harassment drained Roman manpower and morale over time. The risk of rebellion within newly conquered territory was another deterrent. Even if Rome managed to take Arabian cities or oases, maintaining order would require permanent garrisons, further stretching an already overextended army. The cost of occupation, both in money and men, outweighed the benefits Rome could extract. Unlike other provinces, Arabia offered little immediate wealth to justify such a commitment. Additionally, the empire faced competing priorities on multiple fronts. Persia, Germania, and the Danube borders all required attention, leaving little capacity for long-term Arabian campaigns. Emperors had to make pragmatic decisions, expend resources on a harsh desert for minimal gain, or focus on regions offering strategic, economic, and political advantage. Arabia fell into the latter category of impractical ambitions. In conclusion, Rome's failure to control Arabia was not due to a single factor, but a combination of overextension, logistical difficulty, and the need to prioritize other, more manageable territories. Even the most disciplined legions could not overcome deserts, mountains, and endless supply challenges. The Arabian Peninsula was a land that punished every attempt at conquest, demonstrating that even the greatest empire had limits imposed not just by enemies, but by distance, terrain, and practicality. Resistance from local tribes was another decisive